In 1940, Britain faced an impossible choice. The destroyers it needed to escort the Atlantic convoys cost upwards of £500,000 each for the fleet classes the Royal Navy had been building in the late 1930s. The K-class at roughly that figure, the Tribal class at slightly more, took 18 months to complete from keel to commissioning and required crews of 200 trained officers and ratings to operate. Britain had neither the money, the time, nor the men. So it ordered something else. A ship that cost a fraction of that price, took 8 months, and could be crewed by trawlermen and fishermen who already knew how to handle commercial marine engines in rough water. 145 of them through the Royal Navy alone, eventually close to 300, counting Canada, Australia, the Free French, the Belgians, the Norwegians, the Greeks, and every other Allied operator that built or received the same hull during the war. The Admiralty called them corvettes, the crews called them tin tubs. Hitler's submariners called them the worst thing that happened to them. This isn't a story about courage or sacrifice. It's a story about a procurement decision made under impossible constraints that turned out to be better than anything the Navy had planned, and about why the people responsible didn't fully understand what they had done until it was over. Start with the numbers that made the decision unavoidable. In September 1939, the Royal Navy entered the war with somewhere between 146 and 184 destroyers, depending on whether vessels in refit and reserve are included in the count. The operational picture at either end of that range was already strained. Pre-war planning had imagined a naval war structured around fleet actions, a confrontation between capital ships in the North Sea or the Channel approaches, with destroyers deployed as fleet screens. The convoy lanes didn't fit that planning template at all. Attrition began immediately and accelerated during the disasters of spring and early summer 1940. Between April and July, the Norwegian campaign and the evacuation at Dunkirk cost the Royal Navy 24 destroyers, not damaged, not repaired, but sunk outright or written off as beyond economic recovery. Every destroyer lost at Dunkirk was a destroyer not stationed off the western approaches, not running escort around a convoy of tankers and freighters keeping Britain supplied. By December 1940, the total stood at 35 destroyers, sunk or damaged beyond repair since the war started. The monthly shipping losses traced a trajectory that senior Admiralty figures understood with terrible clarity. The U-boats sank 58 merchant ships in June 1940 alone. July 1940 brought 105 ships. Across the 12 months from July 1940 to July 1941, the losses were consistent enough and severe enough that historians later identified the period as the one in which the supply situation became most grave. Monthly losses eventually peaked at 143 ships in July 1942, a single month's destruction. And across the full 6 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, 2,753 Allied merchant ships went to the bottom. 14.5 million gross tons of cargo carrying capacity destroyed. The U-boats didn't need to sink everything to win. They needed to remove enough capacity from circulation that the margin between ships required and ships operating fell below the minimum needed to keep Britain functional. Simultaneously, 2 million gross tons of merchant shipping, 13% of the available British fleet, was sitting in harbour under repair by the end of 1940. Not sunk, not lost, simply unavailable, removed from the convoy runs by accumulated damage across 15 months of war. There was also the endurance problem, less discussed, but arguably more consequential than the raw numbers suggest. Many Royal Navy destroyer classes in 1939 and 1940 had been designed for fleet screening in North Sea and Channel operations, the short-range, high-intensity warfare that pre-war planners had expected. Running at economical escort speeds across the full width of the North Atlantic, maintaining convoy station through Atlantic winter swells for days at a stretch without refueling, was a fundamentally different operational requirement from what those ships had been built for. Some destroyer classes simply couldn't sustain it. They ran out of fuel before they ran out of ocean. A destroyer that had to break contact with its convoy to refuel at a mid-Atlantic staging point had, at that moment, ceased to provide the escort continuity that keeping merchant ships alive required. Churchill understood the crisis as a political and diplomatic emergency and pressed Roosevelt accordingly. His 1940 messages to Washington asked specifically for destroyers, old American vessels from the reserve fleet, over age, imperfect, but hulls afloat and capable of convoy duty in some fashion. He asked specifically for the loan of 40 or 50 of America's oldest destroyers. The answer came on September 2, 1940. 50 Town-class destroyers, surplus American vessels from the First World War era, transferred to the Royal Navy in exchange for 99-year rent-free leases on British territory across the Caribbean and Western Atlantic. The first 8 sailed for Canada on September 6th, loaded with ammunition, food and stores. 50 old destroyers, several requiring months of refit before they could operate. They helped. They weren't the solution. The solution had already been ordered a year earlier, before the war had started, by a relatively minor design approval from a division of the Admiralty that probably didn't regard what it was approving as particularly consequential. On 27th of February 1939, 6 months before war was declared, the director of the Tactical Division of the Admiralty formally approved a sketch design submitted by William Reed of Smith's Dock Company of Southbank-on-Tees, Middlesbrough. The firm's qualification for the job was its commercial record. Smith's Dock had spent decades building trawlers and small vessels for fishing fleets and whaling companies. By 1910, it had built 108 whale catchers for commercial clients. Not warships, but the kind of vessel that had to operate in the South Atlantic and Antarctic in conditions that would test almost anything afloat. The company also had a prior Admiralty relationship. During the First World War, it had designed a Z-class whaler for naval use. When the 1939 requirement arrived, the Admiralty needed something large and cheap that could be produced at small commercial yards. Yards with no experience building warships and no practical way to be converted to that purpose, given how urgently the need was emerging. Smith's Dock was the firm that could answer it. Reed's solution began with a vessel his firm already knew how to build. Southern Pride was a steam-powered whaler Smith's Dock had launched in 1936. She had been built specifically for the commercial whaling trade, the kind of operation that sent vessels to the Southern Ocean for months at a time, far from any port, through weather that would test a hull's fundamental seakeeping in ways that North Sea patrol vessels would never encounter. The round-bottomed hull that Southern Pride represented was optimized for surviving sustained open ocean conditions rather than making speed. Her engine room ran on marine oil-fired boilers, commercially produced, entirely standard in the trawler and fishing industries. Reed proposed adding 30 feet to Southern Pride's length, scaling the design accordingly. Armament and equipment would be grafted onto the commercial template. The critical decision, the engineering choice that made the entire program viable, was about the boiler. Standard naval warship specifications called for water tube boilers. They were more thermodynamically efficient, capable of higher steam pressures and faster response, and they were exactly what wasn't available. Water tube boilers required 7 months or more from order to delivery. Marine oil-fired boilers, the same commercial type Smith's Dock used in its trawlers and whale catchers, could be procured within 16 weeks. Reed substituted the commercial boiler for the naval specification. That single decision eliminated the supply chain bottleneck from the construction critical path entirely. Any small commercial shipyard that already built trawlers and fishing vessels could order the boiler from existing suppliers, work the machinery with its existing workforce, and complete the vessel on a timeline that matched the war's actual urgency, rather than the peacetime supply schedules that standard naval construction assumed. The Admiralty approved Reed's sketch design on February 27, 1939. 26 vessels were ordered on 25th of July 1939, 30 more on 31st of August. By the end of 1939, 110 ships were building or on order across British yards. The naming convention was Flowers. The class began officially with HMS Gladiolus, and the names that followed across the years covered every genus the Naval Naming Committee could plausibly reach: Bluebell, Snowflake, Campanula, Wallflower, Clover, Marigold, Rhododendron, Penstemon. The Atlantic campaign would be fought partly under a botanical index whose incongruity with the actual work being done aboard those ships was noticed by nearly everyone who served on them. Reed eventually received a knighthood for his work. The Admiralty's institutional attitude toward the class itself is captured in a contemporaneous account of Atlantic escort operations with unintentional precision. The corvettes were used for want of anything else. That phrasing reflects the genuine institutional view. These ships were ordered because they could be built, not because they were wanted. Sub-Lieutenant Nicholas Montserrat was appointed to the Flower-class corvette HMS Campanula in August 1940. He described her as the 22nd of 222 ships of this type built in Britain and Canada during the war. He then spent years at sea on Flower-class corvettes and wrote about what that meant in 3 corvettes and eventually The Cruel Sea, accounts specific enough in operational detail to function as primary sources on what service aboard the class actually involved. 19-year-olds from inland cities who had never sailed before their naval training arrived aboard Flower-class corvettes and discovered that everything implied about naval service was accurate, and everything implied about comfort was completely false. The round-bottomed hull, the whale catcher form, optimized for open ocean survival, produced rolling characteristics that no amount of time at sea entirely acclimatized crews to. 80-degree rolls were described as common in heavy Atlantic weather, 40 degrees each side of vertical. The standard description among those who served on them was that the ships would roll on wet grass. The well-deck amidships shipped water on every dip of the forecastle into an oncoming wave, not occasional spray, but cascades of green North Atlantic seawater over the working deck, through hatches that had to remain accessible to ammunition magazines below. Interior decks were continuously wet. Condensation dripped from the overheads. In the original Flower design, the galley was located at the stern, the position on the hull most exposed to the ship's pitching and rolling, and farthest from the mess deck where the crew actually ate. Carrying a pot of anything hot from the galley forward involved crossing a well deck that was routinely awash, in weather that kept everything moving in 3 directions simultaneously. The head drained to the sea through a straight pipe. In following seas, the ocean drained the other direction.
By 1941, corvettes were carrying twice the crew the original specification had contemplated, because sustained convoy escort across the North Atlantic demanded more hands than any peacetime calculation had predicted. Men slept where they could find a surface that wasn't constantly awash, on lockers, on tabletops, in any compartment that offered the combination of warmth and relative dryness that passed for comfort on a small vessel in a North Atlantic winter. When Montserrat described the experience of running to action stations in the dark, it wasn't navigating a vessel, but navigating a soaking, pitching enclosed space where everything not secured had been displaced by the most recent wave sequence. The diet ran heavily to corned beef and powdered potato. The cold was constant and structural, not a condition that varied with the weather, but a baseline characteristic of being on a small steel ship in the North Atlantic between October and April. None of this destroyed the ships. No Allied sailor was ever lost overboard from a Flower-class corvette during the war outside of combat. A remarkable figure for a vessel class that spent 4 years in the most demanding sea conditions the war offered. The hull that rolled viciously was also the hull that stayed upright when larger, more sophisticated vessels would have struggled. The seakeeping was genuine. The nickname the crews gave them was the Pekingese of the ocean. Small, tenacious, with ideas about their own dignity that the North Atlantic declined to respect. The cost comparison at the centre of this story requires precision, because the figures shift substantially depending on what is included in the accounting. The hull contract price in 1939 and 1940, the bare cost of the vessel's structure before armament, sensors, propulsion fit and operational equipment, ran to approximately £20,000 per ship. Fully equipped for combat service, with the 4-inch bow gun, depth charge throwers and racks, ASDIC sonar dome, radar, and the complete equipment fit for operational anti-submarine work, the cost rose to approximately £90,000. Both figures are accurate. They measure different things. The destroyer comparison requires specifying which class, because the range is enormous. A K-class destroyer in 1939, 1,690 tons, ordered under the pre-war building programme running alongside the corvette orders, carried a parliamentary cost of £500,000, established by a Hansard written answer in that year. The tribal class ran to approximately £520,000 per hull. These were the fleet destroyers the Royal Navy was building for the war it had anticipated. Not patrol craft or dedicated escorts in the Flower-class mould, but ocean-going fleet warships capable of operating with the battle fleet in any theatre. At £90,000 fully equipped against £500,000 for a K-class, the ratio is approximately 1 to 5.5. At the £20,000 hull price against mid-range destroyer estimates of around £200,000 that appear in other period accounts, figures likely reflecting smaller escort destroyers or different component breakdowns, the ratio approaches 1 to 10. The precise figure depends on the accounting basis and the destroyer class used for comparison. The honest range across the methods available is somewhere between 1 to 6 and 1 to 10. At any ratio in that range, the industrial implication is the same. 6 to 10 corvette hulls for the price of one fleet destroyer meant 6 to 10 convoy escort stations covered for the same programme budget. Britain was buying coverage. At the scale the convoy lanes required, coverage was the variable that mattered. Build time, 8 months from keel to commission, was the design target. HMS Agassiz provides a verified example. Keel laid April 17, 1940.
Launched September 12, 1940. Commissioned January 23, 1941. Approximately 9 months actual. A 1941, approximately 9 months actual. A fleet destroyer required 18 months. In the time a destroyer yard could produce 1 hull, a corvette yard could deliver 2. Crew: 85 officers and ratings in the original Flower class, rising to 90 in the modified variant. Destroyers required crews of 200 and above. 3 corvettes could be crewed with the manpower absorbed by 1 destroyer, with 15 to 30 sailors to spare. Top speed, 16 knots. A surfaced Type 7 U-boat could make 17 knots on the surface. A corvette couldn't catch one in open water. This was known before the first corvette was commissioned, and the Admiralty accepted the limitation because the operational calculus wasn't actually about chasing surfaced submarines. It was about staying with the convoy continuously across the full Atlantic run, in all weather, without breaking the escort screen to refuel. Endurance: 4,650 miles at 13.2 knots on near full fuel capacity. That range allowed a Flower-class corvette to maintain convoy station from Liverpool to Halifax, approximately 2,400 miles one way, and return without a refueling stop. Many Royal Navy destroyer classes in the 1940 and 1941 inventory, designed for fleet operations in the North Sea and Channel, couldn't sustain that range at escort speeds without breaking contact with their convoy to top up fuel. The escort continuity that mattered for keeping merchant ships alive was precisely what the slower, more fuel-efficient corvette could provide continuously, and what the faster, range-constrained destroyer in several classes couldn't. The speed deficit was real. The endurance advantage was the reason corvettes ended up in the deep Atlantic instead of on the coastal patrol routes they had been designed for. Between 1940 and 1944, Flower-class corvettes participated in the confirmed sinking of 47 German U-boats and 4 Italian submarines, 51 total. That figure is consistent across the post-war assessment committee's revised accounting and multiple independent secondary records. Some tallies, counting shared credits more generously, approach 60. The conservative floor, reflecting the tightest attribution methodology, sits around 47. In absolute terms, Royal Navy destroyers killed more U-boats, approximately 174 across all theatres and all years, compared to the corvette total of 47 to 51. Frigates accounted for approximately 187. Aircraft claimed more kills than any surface platform. On raw totals, corvettes aren't the leading submarine killer. Raw totals need context to mean anything. Destroyers operated across every theatre the Royal Navy entered during the war. Mediterranean fleet screening, Arctic convoys to Murmansk, anti-surface warfare in Norwegian waters, offensive sweeps through the Bay of Biscay, hunting U-boats on their transit routes from French bases to the open Atlantic. Operations in the Indian Ocean and Pacific. A destroyer kill attributed to a Bay of Biscay offensive sweep in 1943 is categorically different from a corvette kill in the North Atlantic convoy lanes the same year. Different tactical context, different operational purpose, different ratio of convoy protection to independent offensive action. Flower-class corvettes operated in essentially one context throughout the war: convoy escort in the North Atlantic. Their 16-knot top speed made fleet action impossible. Their armament, 1 4-inch gun, depth charge throwers and racks, ASDIC sonar,
was optimized entirely for anti-submarine work in a convoy protection role. Their endurance profile made them ideal for sustained convoy escort and unsuitable for the wide-ranging offensive missions that destroyers also performed. They were assigned to the convoy lanes because that was all they were built to do, and they stayed in the convoy lanes for 4 years. The relevant measure isn't absolute kills across all operations in all theatres. It's what each hull contributed to the specific mission, protecting convoys in the North Atlantic against the cost of deploying it. At £90,000 per fully equipped corvette, 47 confirmed German kills from a fleet that reached 294 hulls represents a construction cost per kill substantially more efficient than any destroyer program split across 6 simultaneous mission types across multiple theatres. The destroyer kills attributable specifically to North Atlantic convoy escort. The subset, genuinely analogous to what corvettes were doing, would require archival work in the primary records to isolate from the headline 174 total. But the directional argument holds without that number. A cheaper single-mission vessel achieved its kills at lower construction cost per engagement than a more expensive multi-mission vessel, whose deployment time was divided across competing demands on every ocean the war reached. The post-war Allied Anti-Submarine Assessment Committee reviewed all wartime kill attributions using German records that became accessible after 1945. Kills provisionally credited during the battle were in some cases reassigned between vessel types. Shared engagements were adjudicated differently when the full record was available. The 47 German kill figure reflects that revised accounting. Whether the true Flower class total sits closer to 47 at the conservative end or approaches 60 when shared credit is handled more generously, the order of magnitude is consistent across sources. What those 47 kills can't capture is the tonnage that never went to the bottom because a corvette was present when a U-boat decided not to attack or failed to press an attack that might otherwise have succeeded, or submerged and lost the surface speed needed to reach attack position before the convoy moved past. HMCS Sackville, in 2.5 years of continuous operations from February 1942 to July 1944, escorted 30 convoys, carrying 1,380 ships. Her confirmed U-boat kills over that period aren't prominently detailed in the surviving operational records. What is documented is 1,380 ships delivered. The Flower class's contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic can't be measured exclusively in the post-war kill tally, which is itself an acknowledgement of how effective convoy escort actually works. In early August 1942, HMCS Sackville, pendant number K181, commissioned in 1941, is escorting convoy ON115 westbound across the North Atlantic. The convoy moves at roughly 8 knots on average, the speed of its slowest merchantman. 85 officers and ratings. Cold, wet, 2 days out of any port in any direction, the hull rolling through 30 degrees in the Atlantic swells. The ASDIC operator, the higher submarine detector, working the sonar gear in a confined compartment below the bridge, calls the bearing. The distinctive ping return of metal hull displacing water, different in character from the thermal layers and biologics that produce false contacts, bearing off the port quarter. The commanding officer orders contact investigated. The ship alters course. What follows is the operational core of what the Flower class actually did. Not a rapid sprint to intercept, not a fleet gunnery action, but a methodical contact sequence,
closing, holding the bearing, calculating depth and range, ordering the attack. Depth charge throwers on both sides of the hull fire their cylindrical charges outward in a calculated pattern. The rails at the stern roll additional charges off into the wake, sinking toward preset depths before the hydrostatic pistol's arm and the torpex detonates. The shock wave comes back through the hull as a series of concussive thuds, felt in the bones before heard in the ears. Each one a calculated pressure wave aimed at a volume of ocean where the sonar said something was hiding. Contact is lost in the turbulence of the detonations. Sackville circles, the ASDIC operator sweeping through the bearing arc, listening for the return. Reacquired. The attack continues. The U-boat is manoeuvring, changing depth, trying to open the range. Within 24 hours, Sackville has detected and engaged 3 separate German U-boats. She severely damages 2. None appear in the post-war confirmed kill tally. The damaged submarines reached port or were lost under circumstances attributed to other causes, or the damage fell short of the threshold required for a kill credit. By the formal accounting, Sackville's August 1942 engagement produced nothing. The convoy produced 30 merchantmen delivered. She is preserved in Halifax now, maintained by the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust at Sackville Landing, the only surviving Flower-class corvette in the world. The modifications applied during the war are visible in the hull. The extended forecastle of the modified Flower design that gave the crew marginally more covered space and the ship slightly better stability. The repositioned mast. The additional depth charge stowage added as operational experience taught crews that the original specification had not allowed enough capacity for a prolonged convoy engagement. She isn't quite the vessel she was when she commissioned in 1941. No Flower-class corvette remained unchanged for long. The war kept modifying them as it taught the officers and crews and dockyard technicians what the North Atlantic actually required. HMS Bluebell, pendant number K80, isn't preserved anywhere. On 13th of February 1945, Bluebell towed HMS Denby Castle, a Castle-class corvette hit by U-992's torpedo, into the Kola Inlet on the Russian Arctic coast. 4 days later, at 17:30 on February 17th, approximately 30 miles east-northeast of Kildin Island, in the same inlet, U-711 fired a Gnat, the German naval acoustic torpedo, the Zaunkönig, designed to home on propeller noise, that struck Bluebell's stern. The detonation was catastrophic. Of her crew of approximately 85, 1 person survived. She was escorting convoy RA-64 outbound from Murmansk when the torpedo hit. The ships she was escorting continued west toward Britain. Bluebell's individual kill record, how many U-boats she had attacked or damaged in the years before her last voyage, isn't prominently documented in the accessible records. What is documented is that 4 days before her sinking, she towed a damaged ship to safety. Then she went back out. 36 Flower-class corvettes were lost during the war. 22 to submarine attack, 5 to mines, 4 to enemy aircraft. The round-bottomed hull that gave them their seakeeping gave them little structural redundancy against torpedo hits. Catastrophic flooding, rather than the survivable damage progression a larger hull might manage. They went where the war was, absorbed their losses at the rate that sustained operations in contested waters over 4 years required, and kept the convoy lanes open. The Hedgehog anti-submarine spigot mortar entered Royal Navy service in 1942, developed at the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a name that somehow perfectly captures both the institutional context and the improvised spirit of wartime British weapons engineering. It addressed the core tactical limitation that had constrained corvette effectiveness since 1940. A standard depth charge attack required the attacking vessel to run directly over the U-boat's assessed position to release the charges. That approach broke ASDIC contact at the critical moment. The sonar dome, projecting below the hull, went acoustically blind in the propeller turbulence immediately under the ship, precisely as the attack was executed. The U-boat commander, who understood what was coming, and after 2 years of convoy battles, experienced U-boat commanders understood exactly what was coming, could hear approaching propellers from significant distance, assess the bearing and closing rate, and change depth and course in the interval between the attacking vessel losing sonar contact and the charges arriving. The detonation sequence gave him time he shouldn't have had. The Hedgehog fired 24 contact-fused projectiles, bombs packed with Torpex explosive, approximately 250 yards ahead of the attacking vessel, into the zone where ASDIC contact remained active and maintained. The attacking ship launched from ahead, maintaining sonar contact through the entire sequence, without closing to the position that broke it. If the pattern found the U-boat, contact detonation at any depth was immediate and definitive. If it missed, no explosion followed, which was tactically useful information in itself, confirming the U-boat was still contactable and the attack sequence could continue from a maintained firing solution. A vessel that missed with conventional depth charges had to circle back and reacquire. A vessel that missed with Hedgehog already knew where its target was and had not lost the sonar contact that let it fire again. By 1943, Flower-class corvettes fitted with Hedgehog and the upgraded ASDIC Type 144 sonar were measurably more lethal in the attack role than the vessels that had sailed in 1940 and 1941. The 47 confirmed kills distributed across the class span the full period, including 2 years before this equipment was available. The Hedgehog improved the rate. It built on a foundation that already existed. Captain Frederick John Walker, Frederick, not Frederick, a distinction that mattered to those who served under him, was the Royal Navy's most successful anti-submarine commander of the war. Between 14 and 17 confirmed U-boat kills are credited to him across his career, depending on attribution methodology. He was Johnny Walker throughout the service, a name as widely known in the Western approaches as any rank designation. He had spent the years between the wars arguing for anti-submarine tactical doctrine that the Admiralty had consistently declined to prioritize, and the wartime record confirmed that he had been right and his seniors wrong. Some accounts suggest his interwar advocacy produced less than glowing fitness reports from seniors who saw an outspoken officer frustrated in a series of assignments that didn't interest him. Those reports proved irrelevant. He was promoted to captain, given extra time in grade to compensate for any delay his earlier reports may have caused, and assigned to Sea Command in 1941. His flagship was HMS Starling, a Black Swan-class sloop. His second support group, formed in April 1943 and based at Gladstone Dock, Bootle, comprised Black Swan-class sloops throughout, faster, better armed and more capable than Flower-class corvettes in almost every performance category. The Black Swan was what Walker's tactics were optimized around when the support groups had enough resources to execute them at their intended scope. But Walker's first major convoy operation, Convoy HG-76, 31 freighters and fleet auxiliaries bound northward from Gibraltar toward Britain in December 1941, was fought with 7 Flower-class corvettes. Marigold, Rhododendron, Convolulus, Penstemon, Gardenia, Vetch and Samphire, alongside his own sloop, Stork, the older sloop, Deptford, and a rotating screen of detached destroyers.
10 German U-boats were moving to intercept. The escort carrier Audacity, a converted German cargo ship carrying 4 Martlet fighters and equipped with no hangar or elevator, was providing air cover for the convoy. Walker had trained his group with the kind of specific, demanding precision that characterizes commanders who have thought about a problem for years before they get the chance to apply what they learned. Depth charge crews drilled to reload within 10 seconds of dropping the last charge, a physical test on dry land requiring something extraordinary on a pitching deck in North Atlantic winter weather. Gun crews were expected to get off 6 aimed rounds within 30 seconds of target acquisition. The commanders learned pre-arranged code words. Buttercup astern specified precisely which maneuver each ship in the group would execute and in which direction, eliminating radio traffic that might alert the target to what was coming. His executive officer, Lieutenant Fileux, was described in a contemporaneous account as having run to action stations with his shirt in one hand and his trousers in the other. The creeping attack that Walker had developed worked as follows. One vessel, typically Walker's own ship, maintained ASDIC contact with the submerged U-boat at a standoff distance of 1,500 to 2,000 yards. A second vessel was guided at near idle throttle, throttled back far enough that its own propellers produced minimal noise, over the submarine's position, directed by radio instruction from the first ship, releasing a preset depth charge pattern on the directing ship's instruction. The U-boat commander's best warning system was passive sonar detecting approaching propeller noise. Conventional attacks were audible from miles away, giving him time to maneuver. The attacking ship in a creeping attack was running so slowly that the first warning was the charges detonating around him. Walker described one engagement during the HG-76 operation in which Stork had turned 3 complete circles in close pursuit before finally ramming and sinking the target, dropping a 10-round salvo of depth charges on shallow setting across the submarine's hull as the sloop ground over it. He noted afterward that he had been surprised to find later by the plot that Stork had turned 3 complete circles. When the ship's guns could no longer depress far enough to engage the U-boat at close range, he wrote that the gun's crews were reduced to shaking fists and roaring curses at an enemy who several times seemed a matter of a few feet away rather than yards. During the running battle around HG-76, Walker's group sank or destroyed 4 U-boats over 8 days of continuous engagement. 21 of 31 merchantmen arrived. The cost included HMS Stanley, blown up by a torpedo with few survivors, and Audacity herself, hit by 3 torpedoes on the final night and sunk quickly. The convoy that Walker's principles were built around, maintaining aggressive continuous pressure on submarines well clear of the merchantmen rather than purely defensive perimeter escort, had worked in its first extended test. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit, established in January 1942, took what Walker and others were learning at sea and built a systematic training and doctrine program around it. WATU ran wargaming exercises, innovative for naval tactical development at the time, that allowed commanders to test new approaches against simulated U-boat behavior, identify failures before they cost ships, and disseminate effective tactics to the expanding escort force. Admiral Max Horton, who arrived as Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches in November 1942 with a pre-war background as a submarine commander,
brought institutional authority and specific operational insight to accelerate the formal shift from reactive convoy escort to proactive hunting. One account described his appointment as moving from poacher to gamekeeper. By early March 1943, dedicated support groups were operational. Each Western Approaches escort group surrendered one vessel to form roving units, freed from convoy assignment, to range offensively around convoy routes, looking for submarines before they reached attack positions. The April 1943 Western Approaches Tactical Policy document codified what 2 years of hard operational experience had built. The connection between Flower-class corvettes and this doctrinal evolution isn't that corvettes invented it, or that Walker built his doctrine around their limitations. His key tactical instruments, when resources allowed, were Black Swan-class sloops with greater capability across the board. The connection is that the operational demands of North Atlantic convoy escort, the specific requirements the battle placed on vessels doing that job continuously for 4 years, rewarded endurance over speed, persistent sonar contact over sprint capability, and the ability to maintain a multi-hour attack sequence rather than close rapidly and disengage. Those were the demands the Flower class met, not by design, but by accident of the whale-catcher hull form that Reed proposed on February 27, 1939. The doctrine that won the North Atlantic emerged from an environment that corvettes, at scale and over years, had defined by being present in it. There is a counter-argument that the evidence requires be acknowledged. The Flower class was a stopgap. Contemporary accounts from the period are explicit about this. The ships were designed for coastal patrol and inshore escort in British waters. They arrived in the deep North Atlantic because nothing else existed in the required numbers at the required cost. The rolling, the flooding, the cramped conditions, the 16-knot top speed. These weren't accepted design trade-offs. They were limitations that operational necessity absorbed because there was no alternative. The corvettes were used for want of anything else. That isn't the framing of an institution that had identified a superior weapon and deployed it strategically. That observation is entirely compatible with the argument that the accident was decisive. What the North Atlantic demanded from convoy escort was precisely what the Flower class delivered without intending to. Range enough to cross the ocean without refueling. Endurance enough to maintain station and sonar contact through extended attack sequences. Numbers sufficient to cover multiple simultaneous convoys across the full width of the ocean. And a construction cost low enough to build and replace in the quantities that sustained attrition demanded. Destroyers designed for fleet actions that almost never materialized in the Battle of the Atlantic, with operational profiles split across fleet screening, surface warfare, and multi-theatre offensive operations, were too expensive per hull, too rare, and in many classes too range-constrained for what the battle actually required. The cheap, slow, mass-produced vessel derived from a commercial whale-catcher hull happened to be optimized entirely by accident and for entirely commercial reasons for the specific operational problem that decided the North Atlantic campaign. This wasn't a procurement success, it was a procurement accident. The distinction matters. The outcome doesn't change it. By 1945, the disposal question was being answered in practice before anyone had formally asked it. Post-war naval restructuring required a smaller, more capable force suited to the deterrence posture of the emerging Cold War, rather than the convoy protection requirements of a 6-year total war. The Soviet submarine threat would demand purpose-built anti-submarine vessels, but not 300 of them. The round-bottomed hulls, the cramped crew conditions, the primitive living arrangements. Wartime expedients that nobody was interested in normalizing into permanent service. Most Flower-class corvettes were scrapped through the late 1940s. Some transferred to Commonwealth and Allied navies: Argentina, Chile, Denmark, Greece, India, Israel, the Irish Naval Service, among others, and continued operational service through the 1950s in navies that could use capable second-hand hulls. A handful became weather ships, their sea-keeping qualities in open ocean finding a peacetime application entirely unrelated to depth charges. HMCS Sackville survived as Canada's naval memorial. By 1947, Royal Navy operational service of the class was effectively finished. The Royal Navy went back to building destroyers. The post-war development of dedicated anti-submarine frigates, the River-class, and its successors, the Whitby-class Type 12 anti-submarine frigates, commissioned from the late 1950s, represents an institutional acknowledgement that a dedicated anti-submarine vessel remained necessary in the post-war force structure, and that the work corvettes had spent 4 years doing couldn't simply be folded into destroyer operations. The Type 12 was faster, better armed, and far more habitable than any Flower-class corvette. It was also substantially more expensive and built in far smaller numbers. The Admiralty had spent 4 years demonstrating that persistent, endurance-optimized, mission-specific anti-submarine vessels could sustain the convoy lanes at scale. It spent the following decade building a more capable, less numerous successor to perform the same function, apparently having concluded that what proved true in wartime was also true in peace, that a dedicated anti-submarine vessel wasn't a wartime improvisation, but a permanent operational requirement. Per-hull costs are established, approximately £90,000 fully equipped for the Flower class, against £500,000 to £520,000 for contemporary fleet destroyers. Across a build run of 294 corvettes, the programme investment was a fraction of the equivalent in destroyer hulls. 6 to 10 corvette stations covered for every destroyer the same money could purchase. The ships that held those stations for 4 years, that absorbed their losses of 36 hulls to enemy action, and delivered 1,380 ships in HMCS Sackville's record alone, were gone from the inventory within 2 years of the peace they had helped to win. The ships that could afford to be everywhere were the ships that won it. The destroyers got the parades, the corvettes won the Atlantic. Stephen Roskill's The War at Sea, 1939 to 1945, across 3 volumes, remains the foundational operational account. Mark Milner's The Battle of the Atlantic covers the Canadian convoy escort dimension in particular depth. HMCS Sackville is open to visitors in Halifax during the summer season. The National Archives at Kew holds the ADM 199 Western Approaches Command Series and ADM 217 for convoy and senior officer escort reports, for anyone who wants to go further into the primary record than secondary literature allows. Subscribe for more stories about the gap between what military planning prepared for and what operational reality delivered.